So now we have a pretty jam-packed session ahead of us, so let's just jump in. For the next hour and 15 minutes, we'll be in a session called Mapping Homelessness and Animal Welfare Systems. The purpose of this session is to help us all understand the complex web of homeless services and animal welfare systems as they are. We can spend a lot of time dreaming about the systems that we want, but to make those into a reality, we need to understand the systems we currently have. But the homelessness and animal welfare systems can be very complex and difficult to understand, even if you live and breathe those systems. For example, I spent years in housing and homelessness, but I only recently learned what a low-income housing tax credit is. For the animal field, there can be confusion over the various roles that different organizations play in a community. Your local SPCA might have a lot of visibility in your community, but are they your municipal animal shelter? Who provides animal control in your town? Who's responsible for humane law enforcement? Sometimes these entities are the same provider, sometimes they are not. So long story short, there's a web of services. And to help us understand the various systems at play, we are going to use a story to help us untangle these systems and hopefully get a clearer picture of how someone moves through these systems. When we understand the map of services that exist, hopefully we can see where our own organizations can plug in and collaborate. So to begin, we are going to start with a storytelling session with Greg and Coffee. Through the story of Greg and his dog Coffee, we will navigate the services available to people experiencing homelessness and their animal companions. Greg will be joining us by phone for a live audience Q&A just after we play his video.
And homeless people are not a monolith. There are a million different types of homeless people. There's a million different types of ways that systems can hurt them and can help them. Because homelessness is a prevalent problem. And it's going to be. People are not numbers, they're freaking people. My name is Greg. I am almost 50. I'm in Brooklyn, New York. I was homeless for 9 years with my dog Coffee. My dog Coffee is a 10-year-old boxer pit mix. She's a rambunctious 10-year-old. Like, for being a 10-year-old dog, she still thinks she's 4. Coffee's really, really playful. We've had a lot of misadventures. Found Coffee abandoned in a field in Chicago, Illinois, when she was just probably about 8 months old. I went around the corner and there's this starving head of a dog with a little scrawny body and tied up, totally not able to move. I went up to go untie her and she bit me. I was able to untie her, and so I rescued her from starving to death. One thing about having a dog is I'm not the best person at taking care of myself, but I am pretty good at taking care of my dog. And through like being able to take care of my dog, I actually started to take better care of myself, which was something that I just didn't have the facility to do all the time. So the dog is kind of an important part of that. Taking care of Coffee has helped me like cut down drinking, and completely quit drugs. Which isn't something that I ever thought that would happen. It's been extremely helpful to me. You have to confront a lot of your problems when you sober up, and that's something that is really hard to do. There's a reason why you're not trying to think about things. I used to just see kind of trouble and danger, and now it's oh no, if I go do horrible things to myself, I have to drag my dog along with me. And I just think that really is something that I didn't want to put her through. And so it's been a struggle, but it's also been really rewarding at the same time. She's been there for me through a lot of hardships. Before my dog came around, I don't remember much of it. I was in a constant cycle of drinking heavily, drugging, depression, a lot of depression over like stuff that had been going on. Everybody has different cracks that they fall through. Like nobody has like the same exact like experience. I've been diagnosed my whole life with major depression disorder. I started being homeless when I was very young. I was like kicked out of my house by my stepfather. So I just kind of grew up with this like culture of young homeless people. You get out of it for a minute, but then you get right back in because it's just like, you really do like start missing that kind of bond of the streets and that bond of like friendships that you make on the streets. Then it gets exciting and you're like, oh, I can just go to a different city and be homeless in a different city. So I ended up in that cycle and I ended up in New York City. I've been doing this since the 90s. Really, I think that like what it is it's just a bunch of poor kids who like don't have much to lose and don't really have that much to gain and just live for the instant and the second. And I think like getting into that mindset is really easy, especially when you already are homeless. When you don't think about the future, it's hard to start thinking about the future. I really kind of just stumbled into like having a place to live. Not really. I wasn't really pursuing it. I was talking to my friend who was getting housing, and he kind of got me into Breaking Ground. One of the reasons why I was able to work through them was because Breaking Ground provided pet-friendly shelters, which would be a huge barrier. I wouldn't have been able to move into a shelter if it wasn't pet-friendly. If they just were no animals, I would still be on the street. And that's one of the things that is something that people like have a problem with everywhere I've ever been. It took a while after I started working with Breaking Ground to get into housing. It took me about a year to get into the shelter. I think that Breaking Ground did a really good job of like being able to work with somebody who probably was a like somewhat difficult client. I think I even declined like to go into a shelter like once or twice, but they still stuck with me through it. They have a good thing about coming out to people and talking to them and figuring out what people need. They're pretty good at pursuing you and getting you like going like, no, you can do this, you can do that, you can do this. The fact that I had a dog never came up with the street team. The only thing they were asking me about with having a dog is whether I needed to get vet care because they run free vet services and stuff. So what they did was they set up a date to meet me to get a lot of things done. The psychiatrist and the vet came out at the same time to give Coffee her shots, write me a prescription for medication and also for the dog. Now you need a prescription from the doctor that says you would do better with an emotional support animal than you would without one. It's hard enough being homeless than to deal with going halfway across town for something a lot of the time. They have a street veterinary team. They have a street everything team. I don't know, this organization's really good at that. After I got my shots and my ESA for Coffee, I was in the shelter even less than a week. Coffee, she made a really, really good friend there, which was great for me because I had a neighbor who liked to take my dog out, which was really nice. One of the things about working with the street team is that it helped me kind of choose what shelter I wanted to live in. I'd lived in a shelter with a dormitory before and I just can't handle that. Because I just can't live with a bunch of people in a room, which I have done before and I just don't like. It just reminds me of jail. I had my own room. I had no curfew. It wasn't even that I wanted to stay out late or that I would stay out late. The thing about not having a curfew is that I just don't want that pressure of having to show up at the shelter. One of the shelters I was at before had a really strict curfew and I was a minute late and I got written up and I had to do extra work around the shelter for 3 days for being a minute late. And I was just like, this is stringent. I understand that they're like militarily trying to get you to get your life in order, but it's like, you're also talking to a person who's homeless, who's fine with being homeless and, you know, isn't really fine with like having a lot of these kind of pressures put on them. Like, you're not working with me, you're kind of like setting this barrier between me and like my own success. Like that's what I feel like a lot of the rules in shelters end up doing, is because it becomes like this extra pressure point. I moved into this building last year, right before Thanksgiving. I live right by the Manhattan Bridge. I live in beautiful downtown Brooklyn, the heart of America. I like the area a lot. I really like the convenience of having a lot of parks. I like living by the water. I like being close to all the metro systems. I think it's funny because this is like one of the most touristy places I've ever lived. A lot of people come here to take pictures of the Brooklyn Bridge. All these people from like different parts of the world all the time. Like I'm always talking to people who are like French or it seems like all during the summer and telling them how to get to the bridge. Coffee, she loves it. There's lots of great parks and there's also the water. During the summer, I take her more to the water. And she loves one of her neighbors here. There's a guy down the hallway who's always like bringing her chicken. There's like a good housing system here, and you just have to go through some stuff and you'll have your own place at the end. I think street teams are important. I think outreach is important. I also think centralized services are important. You have to have a plethora. Homeless people are not a monolith. There are a million different types of homeless people. There's a million different types of ways that systems can hurt them and can help them. And there's some homeless people who aren't like willing or ready to get help at all points. That doesn't make them less human. It means that you have to provide the services that they're ready to receive. You have to meet people where they're at. Because homelessness is a prevalent problem. I mean, and it's going to be. There's not an end-all solution to homelessness. It's really hard to concentrate on like, where are you helping people? Where are you not hurting people? And I think when you break it down to statistics, it's really impossible to know. People are not numbers, they're freaking people. It's like nice to have like other friends that did this. I have like somebody downstairs that I know from being homeless. I have somebody who was in another house in Brooklyn that I know from being homeless. And I have somebody who lives right across the bridge here who I know from being homeless. And then a couple of friends that I've made along the way to getting in this house too. And New York's a nice city to not be homeless in. If I can make it in New York, I can make it anywhere, right?
I'm watching the chat as we're watching his video and loving the encouragement that I'm seeing here. And I agree, Veronica, his laugh is infectious. All right, so thank you for watching, everyone. Now, as I mentioned at the top of this session, Greg has joined us by telephone for an audience Q&A. So thank you for joining us, Greg. Greg, are you with us? How are you today?
I'm doing okay.
All right, good.
I just had a panic attack. I was hearing my own voice just sent me a panic attack.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you panic. I panicked a little bit too, but we're all good now. So people have been putting their questions in the chat and in the Q&A for you. And people are super excited that we were able to figure out the audio issue. So folks, if you have some questions, feel free to put them either in the chat or in the Q&A. I'm looking at both of them. And while people are doing that, Greg, I have a couple of questions for you myself. So in the video, you mentioned that you mentioned a lot of things that Breaking Ground did right. You know, they went to you, they consistently engaged you for a year, even though you declined to go into shelter at least once or twice. They brought a psychiatrist and a veterinarian to you. So they quite literally met you where you were. So without that kind of persistence, do you think you would have ended up where you are today?
No.
Right? It's that simple. No.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would have. It's hard for me to gauge like what I would follow through with at different times. You know what I mean? With somebody like coming out and going after me a little bit more and encouraging me and talking to me a few times, it helped ease a little bit. It helped build a little bit of trust with the outreach too.
Right.
And a lot of times, like, you know, I could mean well to go somewhere and just get lost in my own stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I don't know if it would have without the constant outreach coming to see me a few times.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. So, and thank goodness for breaking ground and their persistence and the outlook that they have on their work. So, I have some questions for you in the chat. You've had a lot of adventures with coffee. I imagine she would have gotten into trouble at some point. Did you ever have help with covering the cost of veterinary care?
No, I actually, let's see, the real veterinary care that she got was getting fixed, which I got for free.
Hmm.
And then there was a few times where I've ran into the only other time I took her I've been really careful to like not let her get too far gone with like getting injured and stuff. She's never suffered a major injury. So
Yeah. Well, that's impressive. That's impressive. The spay neuter, the free spay, no, the spay that you got. Do you remember that process and who assisted you with getting that free spay?
it was in Michigan, and I think it was through the AC or through the ASPC there, or the Humane Society there had a program to help low income people get their dog spayed and neutered at a low income price. And when they saw me, they just knew I didn't have a house, and they were like, "We'll just do it for free, and we'll just cover the cost." And it was like going to be like $80, which I did have, but they wouldn't take my money from me, which was fine with me.
Well, I'm glad you got to hold on to your $80.
Yeah.
Was there ever a conversation like was there ever a moment where you felt reluctant to spay coffee?
No. I think there was like I had a little bit of fear about not being able to cover the cost, but as far as like getting her spayed, I'm really pro spaying neutering animals.
So you really just needed to be presented with an opportunity to get her spayed, and it was like, yeah, just get her
Yeah.
spayed. Hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, my dog sleeps in the same bed as me. I don't need all that, you know.
Right. Right. All right. um, so
And I don't need puppies.
and you don't need puppies. Yeah.
A few of my friends choose not to spay their dogs, and I don't understand. I don't understand what they're thinking.
And is that a conversation that you have with them?
Um, no, because it's their decision at the end of the day. I can't convince them that it's a better option. That you're going to stop your dog from getting cancer. It's better for their health and all this stuff. They're just dead set on not getting their dogs fixed. They think it's unnatural. So I mean, as much as it's a conversation, it's like, where are you going to go with somebody who's kind of just thinks about things differently than you?
And there's somebody in the chat who chimed in and said, "You sound like an amazing advocate for spay neuter."
I hope so.
So from the same person, actually, she asked, "Did you ever have issues with local animal law enforcement while being unhoused?"
Yes, especially because of the breed of my dog. Being like, there's a lot of places with pit bans, and so I just be chased out of town. Like, people would call the police because I have a dog. I've also been arrested with my dog, which has been its own problem. That's actually the time I had to get her that's the one time I had to get money for my dog. I had to get like almost $200 to get her out of being kept in Chicago, which I did. I don't want to go through the whole process, but yeah, I did. And then I was arrested another time with her, and she was taken to a kennel in a small town in Kentucky. They had a nice kennel for her, but that ended up being a mess too. But yeah, so like when I've gotten arrested, both times I've gotten arrested, it was a big pain in the butt. And like both of those, neither of those were because of the dog, but I have had like law enforcement come and to for the breed of dog, and I've also had people just call that I had a dog, like call the police because I had a dog, which was kind of like okay. And the police would show up and they'd run my name and they'd be like, "We just got a call because you had a dog." I'm like, "Is that illegal?" No, okay. So, and
Right.
there's people can be weird about you being homeless with a dog, that they can decide that like, oh, I better call the police because this person's probably abusing their animal or something weird. So that's happened to me a few times.
Yeah, I'm sorry that happened to you, Greg. I mean, you obviously love coffee with all of your heart and soul, and she's a really happy, healthy dog. So that never should have happened. Well, I have one last question for you, Greg. You have an audience of people who work in homeless services and also people who work in animal welfare organizations. They're here because they want to learn how to better support people experiencing homelessness with animals. What is one thing that you want these folks to hear?
That I want them to hear with the animal services and the homeless services.
Yeah.
It's uh, keep it up. Listen to your clients. Make sure to get some feedback from them. Um, it's hard to advertise. You're trying to get homeless people into your services, which I know is difficult. But try to build it with like through relationships instead of just like working. I think outreach is a great aspect to add to any organization. If you can, just put in a few hours of just going out and talking to your local homeless people and telling them about your organization. And a lot of homeless people don't really trust everybody, and it can be hard to build that kind of trust and communication between them. But just like keep at them, I guess, and don't give up. As far as like other things, it's hard because like I know it's hard to even just get them in, get homeless people into your services, because how do you advertise to homeless people? They're not exactly people you can advertise to. So make sure to on your website, so because people do go to the library to have, if they're looking for services, to have a way to contact your organizations, because people go into libraries where people do have phones and will be looking for help. That's like every time I was with coffee, like how I learned about the spaying and neutering was looking it up online and seeing what the low income cost was, and going through the process of going to the library to research about how to get my dog spayed and neutered. And that's kind of like how I always looked at like other things like getting her shots and stuff, was always constantly going to libraries or using my phone to figure out the best way to get things done.
All right, thanks, Greg. I think that's really sound advice. Well, unfortunately, that's the end of our Q&A time, but thank you for being here, Greg. I appreciate you calling in to chat with us.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I'll nice to talk to all 150 of you. And you guys have a good day.
Thanks, Greg. Take care. All right, so now that we've heard from Greg, we're going to be moving into the mapping part of our session. So to help us untangle the web of services that Greg had to move through in order to get housed, I'd like to invite our speakers and mapper to the virtual stage. So to provide an analysis of the systems, we have Heidi Marston and Amanda Richer. Heidi's work centers on solving complex problems related to socially vulnerable populations, including people experiencing homelessness and military veterans. As Director of Pet Placement Initiatives for PetSmart Charities, Heidi leads the team charged with managing a grant portfolio across the United States and Canada, aimed at breaking down systemic and institutional barriers that prevent people from experiencing the human-animal bond through supporting the work of shelter and rescue partners across North America. Prior to this role, Heidi served as CEO of the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority and logged more than a decade working for the US federal government, where she held various roles, including Special Assistant to the Secretary of the US Department of Veterans Affairs and Director of Community Engagement and Reintegration at the Greater Los Angeles VA Healthcare System. Heidi is also on the board of directors for My Dog Is My Home. So thank you for joining us, Heidi. Amanda Richer is a displacement consultant for One Health Clinic and in Seattle, King County. Her commitments include being a community liaison for the unhoused and nonprofits contracted through the Seattle Department of Neighborhoods, Vice Chair of the Consumer Review Panel for Seattle Public Utilities, co-founder of Shelter App, among many other roles with advocacy and nonprofit groups. Amanda is also a photographer and an amazing artist. She provides supplies for those providers giving outreach and leverages her lived experience of homelessness to advocate and educate on vulnerability, displacement, human rights, and the interconnectedness of our world and experiences. Amanda found the companionship of her dog while living in a homeless encampment. She is now housed and shares her home with many animals. So thank you for being with us, Amanda. And visually representing the analysis that Heidi and Amanda will be providing is Ian Musa. Ian is a first-generation Palestinian with a deep commitment to social, racial, and economic justice, driven and guided by his lived experience and significant system exposure. A certified Lean Six Sigma Black Belt, EMP, and 100% service-connected U.S. Marine Corps veteran, he is known for his highly strategic and efficient approaches to improving internal processes across large-scale, complex operations and programs for government, 501c3s, and corporations, with extensive experience in finance, human resources, information technology, performance management, data analytics, program design, and strategic planning. Long list of skills. He is passionate about supporting teams who are committed to advancing service-driven missions and taking human-centered approaches to solve the most persistent systemic challenges. So thank you for being with us, Ian. So everyone, there will be a few minutes at the end of the session for question and answer. So if something should come to mind during the analysis and mapping, please do drop your questions in the Whova Q&A window. So now I will be turning it over to the three of you. I am very excited about this.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. So my colleagues and I talked about the best way to go through this. And I think, Ian, if you want to share your screen, what we wanted to go through is sort of each stage that Greg talked about, both over the phone and in his video, and sharing obviously what Amanda knows well and the systems that I've worked within, and then obviously answer any questions at the end. But as a very starting point, we thought we would talk about the systems that led Greg to where he became unhoused in the first place, because I think it's a really important context to provide. As everybody here knows very well, we have designed safety net systems in our society that are meant to catch people that are going through crisis situations, whether that is poverty, whether that's mental health, whether that is economic and job security. And in any case where somebody ultimately becomes unhoused and has no choice but to sleep on the sidewalk or in their car or on the street, there are a tremendous amount of systems that have failed those individuals. And Greg is certainly no exception. You heard through Greg's story that you He started experiencing homelessness at a very young age when he was a child, and the youth systems and the child welfare systems that were supposed to catch him didn't, and he fell through those cracks. You have poverty that he talked about interlaced in there, a lack of parental support, as well as mental health and addiction that Greg talked about. And all of these systems that were really meant to be put in place for Greg were not there. On the other side, you have Coffee, who encountered Greg, who he said was tied up when he found Coffee. And, you know, there's a lot of assumptions we have to make about what led Coffee to be tied up. You know, it could be that the person who had Coffee was fleeing something unsafe and thought that Coffee was safer there, and hoped that somebody found Coffee. And in this case, they were really lucky that Coffee and Greg found each other, and that she's in a great place. But there are a lot of things in both of these stories that went very wrong, that led them to the point that they met and then ultimately went on that journey together. But I'll pause there. And Amanda, is there anything else you want to add in terms of the contributors?
No, I think you went through it quite a bit. I think that's good.
Awesome.
I like how you brought in the youth services, of course, but just even before that, familial support, right? So it really goes down to, and I think that we see across, you know, a wide range of people that adverse childhood experiences later in life really do put somebody at risk for further homelessness. So thank you for pointing that out. I would say that also the systems of meeting people where they're at. So Greg had talked about not wanting to be in a congregate shelter, you know, because of it made him feel like, again, being institutionalized, like jail. And a lot of people have a problem with that. And if the service isn't right for someone, then it's perfectly natural that they would decline that service and try to figure things out on the.
Oh, you muted yourself, Amanda.
I'm so sorry. Can you? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my connection went out. I am so sorry.
No problem.
So I was just gonna say, so making sure that you rebuild that trust every time someone goes to a service that they've been referred to and it doesn't work out, there's a bond broken there. And so I think that having the outreach teams that provide multiple services, right? People are trying to survive out there. And when you're undergoing that, or also like he described mental illness, you know, suffering with major depressive disorder, that affects the ability of the person to make appointments and carry through. And it led to you know, acceptance of the situation that never should have been in the first place. I'm going to stop there.
No, it's a great point, and I think it's worth reinforcing too that people who are unhoused, who are experiencing housing instability, regardless of whether they have a mental health diagnosis or struggle with addiction, are actively facing trauma. It is unsafe to be unhoused. It is uncertain. Even if you are perfectly healthy, there is no guarantee that public transportation will come through to get you to the library to look at the internet. There's no guarantee that the food banks you rely on will be open. As we learned even during COVID, the places where you rely on going to the restroom aren't open. And so in addition to it being an incredibly dehumanizing experience, it's also a very traumatic one. And what we see often is you take all of these conditions that people are trying to survive in, and then, as we'll see today, you place perhaps the most complex systems that they have to navigate in order to become housed again. And so you talked a little bit about congregate shelter. And this is the idea, I think the traditional model, at least over the past few decades, of kind of warehousing people. I've heard it, 2 hots in a cot. So you have a cot on the floor, you have a shared living space with individuals, you have congregate eating. He referred to it sort of as feeling like he was in jail. And you hear that a lot. Those environments can be really scary. And you also then layer on having curfew and having rules to an experience that you're already going through, where you're feeling dehumanized. And then these systems saying, on top of all this, we actually don't even trust you to be an adult, you have to be in bed by this time. You have to follow these rules or do chores. And it sounds like breaking ground, and the shelter that he ended up in, that was a private room, was so much more humanizing in so many ways. But do you want to talk a little bit more about that, Amanda, and like kind of that distinction?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to touch upon the point too, when he talked about going to jail, and the systems that were supposed to make sure that the family could be reunited, and ending up a person with no housing and no support systems, had to come up with money they really don't have to try to save their dependent, right? Their family member. Because that also, and he mentioned this a lot, like the valuation of choices. So when you're in situations that are dehumanizing, and you're struggling with different things, whether that be substance use disorder or homelessness, whatever the case is, sometimes in that dehumanizing situation, people can lose value of self. And so valuing that animal, that dependent, and in weighing choices based on the health and well-being of that other animal is really inspiring, and kind of a testament to the bond, and just the way that having the animal can support somebody who is really going through a traumatic event. And I think we understand this a lot when it comes to, I've met therapy animals that go to things like mass shootings, and, we understand therapy animals pretty well. But when it comes to the context of poverty or homelessness, there's a lot of work to be done.
Mhm.
As far as shelters go, you talked about the congregate versus non-congregate. And I think that when we look at the human and animal bond, and you're coming into a situation where there's a lot of noise and a lot of, goings on, and very little time to have space to oneself, um, that can be damaging not only to the human, but the animal as well. So that could be causing behavior issues. And really, I know from myself, having my Rowan, not my dog, Rowan, had to be on her best behavior. She had to be on better behavior than all humans involved in any situation. And if she messed up even once, it could mean us not eating. It could mean, any number of things, but us. So it was always interesting to me, and a little frustrating, that, for an animal also going through this really traumatic situation with me, that that was not really taken into account, that she could also be going through it and having some issues.
Mhm. Yeah, and backing up a little too, we heard in the phone conversation, and then also in his video, about all of the different interactions he had to sort of get coffee, the services that coffee needed. So we heard about the street team. It sounded like there was a street outreach team, and it looks different in different areas, but you sometimes have an ASPCA team. In New York, there's a handful of other agencies that are specifically focused on partnering with human service agencies to provide services for pets of people who are unhoused. But I mean, even just thinking about what he was saying, is we got Coffee stayed in, I think you said Michigan, and then we were in Kansas, and then we were over here. Like the number of logistics that had to be figured out and the organizations they had to touch had to be incredibly stressful. And then to have to experience going to jail, being separated from your animal, that is not only to have it happen once, but for it to happen twice and to be reunited is not always the case for people. And I think it's a big opportunity for these systems to figure out how you work together, because if you don't have a really close relationship with your municipal shelters or boarding facility, and something happens with law enforcement with somebody who has a pet, there really needs to be a way for them to reconnect. It could be jail. It could also be the hospital. Coming from the VA, I worked with a lot of veterans who were unhoused, and they didn't want to go into the hospital to make their appointments because they couldn't bring their dogs with them because they didn't know where to keep them. Very reasonable concerns, right? So it's really about thinking how we create a no wrong door system that led to what I think it's like a magic moment for Greg, where he went to, I think it was Breaking Ground, and he had the veterinarian and the psychiatrist come out at the exact same time. They cared for the needs of the entire family unit together. Coffee got her shots. He got his emotional support letter, which really opens up the door for Coffee to be able to go more places with him, whether it's housing or in public. And that is just something we have to figure out how we normalize a little bit more. But interested in your thoughts too, Amanda.
I would say that one thing that really struck me is the follow through that Breaking Ground had.
Mhm.
So accepting what was being said and working with that person to find ways that it was acceptable for them to get the help that they needed or Greg needed. And so I think that, that key piece of having, of course, the human side, right? Human health care, that's psychiatry, mental health, physical health, paired with that vet service. And I also think there's something to be said when you pair those up with the trust. So kind of like the friend of my friend is my friend. When you're reaching populations like Greg and Coffee, there's a lot of medical trauma, right? These, I'm sure that Greg can attest to, being not getting the care that he needed to receive as far as access. So I think that there's something to be said for that unit going out together, and then also building that bond of trust with when, somebody sees and trusts the vet with their most prized being, right? The one thing that is helping them get through and survive this situation. And you see that veterinarian is trusting and friendly with the healthcare provider. Well, this might not be so bad. And so I think that the core of that is trust building.
Mhm. Yeah, I think trust building can't be understated. And we did ask when we were looking through and preparing for this, how long we saw a short video of Greg's story, but in reality, this spans many, many years, 3, 4, 5 years of Greg's journey with Coffee, of meeting Coffee as a puppy, being unsheltered, going in and out of shelter settings that worked and didn't work, ultimately becoming housed, which is a whole set of complications that we'll get to in a second, and how hard that is and what that takes. But it takes a long time. And I think because we are, at least in homeless services, the need is so great. The trust that's really needed to be built there with people who are unhoused, those systems aren't equipped to do that. And the people who are doing the outreach aren't given the time they need to actually do that work and do those follow-ups and say, you know what, maybe today is a bad day and Greg or whoever, maybe they just want some water and a sandwich and I'll come back tomorrow and we'll try again because it was a bad day today. We all have those. But we really need to create that flexibility in our systems to not only be able to meet people where they are that day, but then when they are ready to say, okay, I've had it, I really want to go into a shelter, I really want to start housing, that we're ready to go the minute they are, and the systems are nimble enough to be able to do that. Coinciding with the animal welfare piece of it too, and getting Greg, his emotional support letter and everything. So there's a lot that sort of has to align in order for all of that to happen at the same time. And again, that makes it really, really complex.
I do want to say something about that's, training our providers in the human animal bond and the benefits of animal ownership, and specifically people who are experiencing homelessness. And I think what Greg said is that the doctor noticed that he would be better off with an emotional support animal. So, training providers to look for that, offer that, because I think a lot of times people don't know to ask, right? They're going through this, it's really traumatic, and training those providers to notice that and offer letters of support. And of course, working with legislation in cities and towns to make sure that, they're being accepted.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the other piece of this too is the housing piece, and recognizing the process that it takes to actually get to the point where you could actually move in and you see the outcome like Greg and Coffee had, right? So what does it actually take to get from being unhoused into permanent housing where you sign a lease? That means for a really long time, you're working on, you probably need a birth certificate. You probably need some sort of housing voucher to be awarded to you. You definitely need an ID, which doesn't always, people don't always have on hand. You need to fit the right criteria of whatever that housing is. So some housing units, you have to be considered chronically homeless, which is a very specific definition. Some you have to have certain conditions to qualify to access that housing. It is a really long paperwork process, and keeping all of that together while you're also actively experiencing homelessness can be really stressful. And so I think just keeping in mind the complexities that are layered on top, if you have tickets, if you have citations, if you don't have income to pay a security deposit, how do you get that? The problem solving that has to happen is tremendous. But to your point, I think the better that our providers on both sides can, the more that they're working to build that trust with people, the easier the process is, because you're not going to wait until you're in crisis to come and ask for that support. When I was in Los Angeles, we worked a lot with our unhoused folks who were unsheltered also, and could never really get folks to want to engage. And I don't blame them, with all the people that probably come up to them and offer something that they don't follow through on or make a promise. But what was really successful for me always was asking how their dog or cat was doing, and asking where they got it and if they need some food. And I guarantee they did, because their pets will eat before they do. So really just figuring out what it takes to meet people where they are with the services that they are ready to receive at that time, instead of coming in and saying, here's what we think you should be doing.
I also would like to say too, on the animal welfare side, working very closely with animal control and any enforcement on that level, as to understanding how to give people the support so they can be the best pet parents they can be, right? So that means engaging our food banks. That means making sure that donations are coming in, having good collars and leashes and ways to secure the animal are huge. So I just wanted to kind of pinpoint that for a second.
Absolutely. And so if folks who are on the line who are in the homelessness services side, this is a really good opportunity to start reaching out and figuring out who are those agencies on the animal welfare side in your community, who can help support people who have pets, and particularly those who are unhoused. What are the food banks in the area that offer pet food in addition to human food? There's a really great website called pethelpfinder.org, where you can type in your zip code and it gives you everything from your local low-cost spay neuter to your local pet food bank to basic vaccines and medical care. Utilize those resources out there so that when you do encounter somebody who's unhoused with a pet, you're really treating the pet as a part of that unit, as opposed to what sometimes happens where we try to sever that bond and break that tie, because it's easier perhaps to house an individual without the animal attached to them. And I know we had talked a little bit about, Amanda, about like this whole, out of this whole process that's very complicated, some of the key takeaways we wanted to make sure that people have walking away from this and hearing Greg's story. And one thing that you and I talked a lot about is the human animal bond. And we just heard Dr. Robertson it was perfect timing for her to go right before and talk about the significance of that bond. But you heard the truth of that in Greg's story, but you also heard Greg talk a lot about community. Community when he was unhoused, community now that he is housed, that is helping him stay housed because there's a loneliness factor. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, both in being unhoused and then also in like as you're in housing, just what role community plays, whether that's with your pets or with people?
Yeah, absolutely. So when somebody becomes unhoused, of course, that social cohesion. So access to support systems, there really is an othering of people experiencing homelessness. And so in that, people want bonds, right? They want safety, and people find safety in community. So you will see people, even if like in Greg's story, he traveled quite a bit. So there may not have been, that settled community, but you're still running into people that you met. There's still, this sense of, banding together through a really, really hard time. Talking about going into housing, having a community member that also loves your animal and is able to help provide those things that may be hard, right? Again, major depressive disorder sometimes can make it very difficult to go out. And so having a community member to have that support. And then also when we look at encampments and we look at, I think that as a society, we are not viewing that as a community, and as it's not viewed the same. But in those situations, and like what Greg experienced, there is a very strong bond built between people that are literally trying to save their own lives and the lives of others in that space. And the animals become friends. And I think Greg spoke to that as well, that the sense of community wasn't just important for himself. There's also an element of socialization for coffee as well. And I think that's important in the health of animals too.
Mhm.
And it also
Absolutely.
makes it more societally acceptable to take your animal in different places if they're socialized well.
Mhm. Yeah. I do think we definitely want to leave some time for questions. I think overall, I hope that sort of walking through this, and Amanda and Ian and I talked about this too, that it is such a complex system and every journey looks different, but has the same elements of challenges and barriers that you have to overcome. And I think the best thing that can happen in the work that animal welfare is doing and in the work that homeless services is doing is figuring out how to work in parallel instead of trying to do everything for all people. And how do we come together and create safety net systems that are much more comprehensive and where we all sort of know what our lanes are and we know who to call in these situations, so that at the center of all of our decision making is the person that needs support and the animal that loves them. And building our decision making and our processes in our system around that framework instead of creating boxes that we try to force people into, that ends up creating a lot of harm and trauma along the way. I don't know, Ian, do you have anything that we missed on the system mapping side?
No, I think it's fine. I know we slated time for questions. It might be helpful to get questions, and I can sort of do this in some more conversations with you two, and we can share it out with the group. But no, I'm fine with this end.
Great. Christina, are we at a good spot that we can take some questions?
Yes, absolutely. And you all are in Zoom, so you can't see the chat in Huva, and I would be happy to help facilitate that. So at this time, I would love to know from other folks, actually, if we can keep the system mapping tool up, that would be great. And that way Ian can continue to map out and visualize the system, and we can ask the audience, are there parts of Greg's story where you picked up on a system that you would like to see on this map? And as folks are putting their thoughts in the chat here, there's one that I would like to really flesh out. And I'm going to do that with your help, Heidi. So Greg had mentioned that a veterinarian went out with the psychiatrist with Breaking Ground's street team. That's a highly unusual arrangement. And in my experience, I think there are a couple of communities that might be like on the very cutting edge of doing that, but I think that's very cool. I think that's super cool. I happen to know that organization, the veterinarian that went out with that team, was from the ASPCA. And I think oftentimes the ASPCA is looked at as if it is the municipal shelter or the animal control agency in New York City, and that's not the case. So there are actually different players within animal welfare that provide different things. So maybe we can sort of parse that out a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. On the animal welfare side, to your point, you have groups like the ASPCA that are privately funded organizations that have a variety of roles. And the ASPCA in particular plays a lot of roles, but in New York specifically does have those street service teams that go out. And I believe they partner with the human welfare agencies. On the other side, you have the municipal services, the animal control. If we're using New York as an example, that's the New York Animal Care and Control. What's really cool about that municipal agency is they also have community outreach teams. And so they're trying to figure out how they build the gap as animal control and the municipal entity, but also serving people wherever they are, instead of a model that I think a lot of shelters are still stuck in because of resourcing, where you just kind of have to wait to see what comes to the door. And then figure out how to deal with it. So we've seen success with municipal agencies really partnering with either human services or private shelters or groups like the ASPCA to figure out how you have a more comprehensive approach in your community to figure out what is it the community needs, so that you're preventing people coming to your front door in their moment of crisis and can hopefully intervene with them sooner with solutions that could be a little bit less traumatic and more sustainable in the long run.
Absolutely. I do want to say too, really importantly, is pairing with community service agencies that offer fostering and boarding. He mentioned going to jail. Here in Seattle, like, we have a boarding facility that can help with that animal when somebody is undergoing treatment or somebody is undergoing, incarceration. So I think that on the animal welfare side is really important.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda, for mentioning that. There are actually a couple of people in the chat that have mentioned law enforcement. So law enforcement entering, exiting the system, and reclaiming a impounded animal. Let's see here. And then Anne also brought up crisis housing in Greg's situation with incarceration, but also those services when someone is housed and potentially has to go to the hospital / rehab, etc.
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest things that agencies should be figuring out how to do on the animal welfare side is where you do have situations where someone ends up in the hospital, they end up in jail, whatever the reason is, and they need that emergency boarding or they need space in the shelter or the kennel. Waive those reclaim fees for people. A fee of $50, I've seen them up to $500 as the barrier for people reuniting with their pet. In the long run, actually costs shelters more money because the pet stays in your care longer when somebody can't afford it, but it also just causes so much unnecessary harm to those people and those pets being apart from each other. So if there's something you can do right away, look at your reclaim fees and figure out how you can waive them or create vouchers, so that at all costs, we're centering keeping that human animal bond together.
All right, and we have some actually really good examples being talked about in the chat. So New York City is obviously like a huge metropolitan area with a lot of resources, although they always feel limited no matter how many there are, right? But there are a lot of resources in New York, and there are other communities that are doing really interesting things, have great examples that I would love to hear from or hear about. So actually, Lori Morton Faisal, if you're willing to expand upon the example that you put in the chat, I would love to hear about it. Are you able to come off of mute and maybe talk about it a bit? Or we can move on to a different example. So there's another example in the chat here from Adrian. As a fostering agency, partnering with law enforcement and city outreach workers has been critical. Pets can be diverted directly to us when their owners are arrested, for example, and then reunited once the owner is released.
Absolutely. And again, it's like all these models where systems are working together to meet people where they are. We heard an example recently of an organization on the East Coast that is the municipal sheltering organization. And when they go out on animal control calls or cruelty calls, they actually now have a veterinarian that goes with them to those calls to figure out what the situation is, what the call was about, and just through embedding those medical professional staff in their animal control teams, they've diverted like 800 animals from coming in to the shelter because it wasn't actually animal cruelty. It's that maybe a person didn't know what they were supposed to do, or they didn't have access to the food that they needed. And so again, it's just thinking about how do we go out and meet people where they are instead of waiting for them to come to us, and the level of cost savings and efficiencies and that creates, the harm that it reduces. In homeless services, the folks on the line will tell you it is always better for the person, better for the systems, and more cost effective to stop somebody from becoming homeless ever in the first place, to do whatever it takes to prevent them from coming in, than it is to actually work them through the system. And it's the same with animal services. So there's a lot of parallels in those models.
That's great. So there's some questions here about this yellow sticky here, shelter entry, congregate, or I'm sorry, they're all yellow down at the bottom. But the last one on the sort of bottom row, yes, that one exactly. Thank you, Ian. So shelter entry, congregate, single unit, etc. Can you unpack that a little bit more? What is the difference? Where did Greg end up eventually that ultimately led him to permanent supportive housing?
I believe he said what was ultimately successful was the dorm style. So that would be, I believe, single unit. And again, the reasoning behind that is personal space, autonomy, being able to think while doing that. Safety is another issue. And many times congregate settings would be able to take companion animals, but have a lot of lack of understanding of how to make that work. So I think that, the education piece on that is really important. But in Greg's case, what he said worked for him was the dorm style.
Mm-hmm. And think about it for folks who may not have seen, the congregate can be sort of your high school gymnasium type room where you have beds lined up next to each other. So you're really sleeping close to somebody else. You're living very close to somebody else that you don't know. In LA, we used hotel rooms and motel rooms really frequently as a non-congregate option, especially during COVID. And again, that privacy and the dignity that it brought to people was tremendous. And then imagine, living in a space with 400 other people and having a pet and not knowing their pets. Dog parks can be stressful for some people. I know they are for me because you don't know all the other pets around. It's no different when you have a bunch of, pets that don't know each other and people that don't know each other in a congregate setting. So it's, again, just really treating people like individuals.
Imagine being at the most vulnerable time in your life, like the time that you are feeling the most unsafe, dehumanized, and then having to be in your most vulnerable moment in that vulnerable space by sleeping. That's the time that you are absolutely the most vulnerable, and having to sleep next to people that you don't know, don't have a relationship with, maybe don't like, but then you're in your vulnerable state, coming in and being expected to be at your most vulnerable around people that you don't know. And that can be stressful, I imagine.
There's actually a question in our Q&A for you also, Amanda. So the question reads, I believe a lot of the success of getting someone in permanent housing is really the gatekeepers at the doors of the shelter, drop-in center, other resource providers. Would you agree, Amanda? Just even getting in the door.
I think that that's true. I also think that there's a lot of siloing. So opening up those avenues for providers to talk to one another and really know what's going on. A lot of case managers may not be aware of places that will take people with pets. There may be, there's so many barriers there. So I say it's definitely some gatekeepers. But I would say a lot of it is the siloing, the lack of communication and really partnering, right? Because in homeless services, it's a lot like a competition. So there is a lot of competition in funding. And so people tend to, have walls so that, their service comes up best rather than collaborating with the whole and figuring out what's best for everyone in the population. So
there's another question here about partnering the local veterinary clinic with the homeless shelter. May appear like a simple question, but it can go in a lot of different ways. So would it be a good thing to match our homeless shelter with our with our vet clinic?
yes. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Greg had mentioned was that he really needed the rabies vaccine, or Coffee needed the rabies vaccine before they could get into the low barrier shelter that was sort of waiting for the bed that was waiting for them there. So yeah, I think Breaking Ground did a lot to remove the barriers, and it would have been a shame if the rabies vaccine was the thing that was sort of like standing in the way, right?
Absolutely.
All right, another question. Would you know of a way to partner with local housing agencies and shelters to find a place for, I think there's a typo here for, I think it's just to find a place for co-sheltering?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll put the link in the chat, but one really good place to start for animal welfare agencies is figuring out who it's called a continuum of care lead is in your region. So every region in the country has what is called a continuum of care for homeless services, and there's a lead agency that's designated to sort of be the point. But what the concept is that agency then helps pull together hospitals, emergency services, homeless services, landlords to figure out a comprehensive response. Animal welfare and shelters should absolutely be at those continuum of care tables as a part of the ecosystem. So the first step is figuring out who that agency is in your region. And I'll send a link in the chat with a way that you can find that. But also ask if you have large homeless agencies. I'm sure you can ask them and they can tell you.
And also the Healthcare for the Homeless Network.
Mhm.
There's one in a lot of communities, and that's where a lot of the providers that are serving this population are going to be. So I think, attending those meetings is also really important, engaging with the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council.
All right, thanks, Amanda and Heidi. So we do have Julia Lewis from, I believe it's San Mateo County in California, who's going to come off of mute and talk a little bit about the model that they have there of sort of integrated animal welfare homeless services systems.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Julia Lewis. I'm a veterinarian. I work at San Mateo County Health, and our program was started kind of on a shoestring, and it's not an official program for our county health department, but we started doing vet care for the homeless back in 2018, providing free services because one of our street medicine outreach nurses reached out when she found out that there were a couple of vets working in the department. When she went out to a homeless encampment and found some dogs that were there that hadn't seen a vet in a very long time, contacted me to go out and help. And from that, we've grown our services to go to quite a few of the homeless shelters, as well as partnering with several of the homeless case management case managers to go out to homeless encampments and at least eliminate the barriers to the folks that are unhoused to get into emergency housing by providing the vaccines, the flea control, medical exams. And thanks to California for All Animals, we received a grant that helps to pay for vet care that we can't provide because we can only provide wellness and preventative care. In that we can refer patients that we find having more involved medical issues, we can refer them to a couple of veterinary practices that have signed contracts with the county to bill our program instead of the client. And the client gets all of these services for free. And we continue to provide the services once they're in the shelters. And even once they move into housing, if they still continue to receive county services in whatever form, we can still provide the vet care. And we work very closely with especially the case managers for our own safety, as well as just an opportunity to go out to the people that need the help. Many times our case manager, the client's case managers meet us with to help the they go out to the client, we go out to see the pets, and in that sense, I will talk about, maybe the pets need to get into shelter because it has a problem. For instance, recently we had a dog that had severe behavior issues. And I talked to the case manager as well as the pet owner that really the benefit is that this animal get into housing with the owner so that it can have four walls around it and feel safe. And I'm hoping that the case managers, and I leave it up to the case managers to do the legwork in getting the client into shelter. But we continue to communicate. The case manager will let me know when that person and that pet has gone into shelter.
Well, thank you for coming off of mute and sharing with us all about your program. Appreciate it. And thank you to Amanda and Heidi and Ian for that session and for walking us through the various systems at play in a case like Greg's. Obviously, every case is individual and every community is different as well. And so these systems and the different ways that people move through them is going to look different. But I hope that this was at least somewhat helpful for all of our different partners here that are coming from different fields to be able to see, who are the animal welfare players, who are the home services players, and what various components of these systems exist. So I just realized that we went over by a little bit. So unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for Q&A, but I do want to encourage everyone to continue to use Whova to unpack everything that we've learned here. If you have an unanswered question, ask it in Whova. There's a wealth of experience and information amongst our conference attendees, not just among our speakers and presenters, obviously, as you have seen. So someone else might be able to answer your question. And again, I'd like to thank you, Ian, Heidi, and Amanda. I think we all learned a lot from you today.